So then, without further delay, let's get into the meat of today's event. So again, this is an online briefing and discussion entitled Realities of Being Principals in Today's Field Operations. And the context for this particular discussion comes from a research paper commissioned by NRC with the support of the OFDA and USAID, as well as Handicap International, looking at principles and pragmatism in conflict settings, and with a particular focus on field perspectives. So this very interesting study has involved examining closely and in 4 specific field contexts, being Colombia, Syria and Turkey, South Sudan and Nepal, looking at real challenges faced in the field, looking at different perceptions of humanitarian principles and how they're applied, looking also at the role of the private sector, as well as the influence of states on principled action. And we're very fortunate to have with us one of the consultants, the research consultants who is working on this study and has just returned from the field and will be presenting the initial findings from these 4 cases in today's event. So just to outline the order of operations for us today, we'll begin with a representative from NRC with a brief overview of the context of the study. We'll then turn to a presentation as mentioned by one of the researchers who's actively working on the study, and then finally we'll move into a panel discussion, bringing in additional voices and of course the input and questions from all of you. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Christian Huber, who's with us today representing NRC. Christian is currently working as Humanitarian Principles Advisor for NRC's Policy and Advocacy team here in Geneva. He started working with the German Red Cross in emergency relief operations in Sri Lanka, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in Vietnam. He then joined the ICRC as a delegate and later head of office, working in Afghanistan, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we're very happy to have him with us here in the office today. And now, Christian, I'll hand over the floor to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna-Margaret. I'm really happy on behalf of NRC and Handicap International to welcome you all here to this online briefing. And thanks again for PHAP for managing and facilitating this webinar here today with us. I just want to present a bit the context of the study and explain a bit about the work of NRC and Handicap International in relationship to strengthening humanitarian principles. So for NRC, humanitarian principles are at the heart of its mission. They serve as a framework guiding our operations and helping to navigate the various operational challenges to access people in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. Handicap International also underlines the importance of the principles in their charter and their principles of intervention, and they strongly voice in favor of humanitarian law and principles. Both NRC and Handicap International, we both aim to strengthen the application of humanitarian principles throughout the humanitarian system in light of the present challenges. Now, part of this is the advocacy work that we're doing here globally and as well here in Geneva, of course. As part of our work here at NRC, we try to get evidence from the field, and we have focused since about 2011 on develop internal guidance to support the implementation of principles and policy engagement with states and NGOs in order to enhance the awareness of and the adherence to the humanitarian principles. We received funding since 2011 from different donors, and since 2013 we received the grant through USAID and OFDA. Part of our work here is examples of our work here is public dialogues between states and humanitarian actors. We've organized several conferences on the issue of humanitarian principle, linking it to different issues. One of the most prominent one was probably the 20th anniversary conference to the 20th anniversary on the Code of Conduct that we organized together with the Federation here in Geneva, where there were about 80 actors from different states, non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, and academia. We organize also roundtable discussions globally, here in Geneva and globally, for example, in Dubai, Stockholm and Washington on this issue. And one of our main roundtable discussions here in Geneva are actually Chatham House discussions with permanent missions together with the ICRC, which we have been engaged to for the last 2 years, where we are able to get the permanent missions to discuss together with us principle to humanitarian action and how it can be strengthened and what it means very concretely in the field. For Handicap International, they put their focus in the advocacy work on the impartiality of humanitarian responses. They're focusing on the most vulnerable that are at risk of being excluded of the response, in particular people with disabilities. Handicap International advocates on the respect for humanitarian law and principles in terms of humanity, the respect and protection of civilians, and they advocate against the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and against the use of non-discriminating weapons. To foster their work here in Geneva and their advocacy work, they are strongly involved in the Interagency Standing Committee's task team on principled humanitarian and revitalizing principled humanitarian action and on humanitarian financing. They also engaged through ICVA on the discussion on humanitarian principles in field operations in their different working groups. Now, I mentioned already that NRC has done a lot of field research and research on the topic, and I want to highlight a few of the points that we have, what we have worked on during the last years. First of all, the most important, one of the very important studies that we did is called Tools for the Job, supporting principle of humanitarian action in 2012 that we did together with ODI. In this study, we concluded that even if there's a strong general awareness on principles by organizations, practitioners still struggle or prioritize humanitarian principle in a consistent and transparent manner. Also, we highlighted that the availability of donor funding can determine whether principled humanitarian action is actually feasible, as they sometimes favor geographic or politically strategic countries. This also links to aspects of funding timelines, administrative procedures, transitional strategies, and different other issues linked to funding. Then I already mentioned the conference on the Code of Conduct in December last year. This conference in the discussion reaffirmed the value and operational relevance of both humanitarian principles and the Code of Conduct. However, that there's often a gap between theory and practice due to the large diversity of different actors. The conference discussed also an increased pressure to conform to the political and security agendas of states and armed groups. It discussed also initiatives to support practical application to shared values at the local level and accountability initiatives which are important to strengthen the implementation of principles. Also, we have just released a report, Engage to Stay and Deliver, that was focusing on the Central African Republic, on which some of the key findings are that there's a lack of understanding and implementation of humanitarian principles and dialogue with communities and local stakeholders, and it's not really clear often how it in humanitarian work. It's also, but however, there's apparently an issue that the population is able to distinguish humanitarians from military, but they continue to question their independence and impartiality. I will talk Andrew later on the current study, so I will not go into detail on this, but we are having, I think, some very interesting initial findings, and I'm happy that he will present them later. So just to go after all this presentation in terms of what we have done, and it gives you a better idea of where this study is coming from. We think that based on all our work and based on all the work that Handicap International has been doing, and in the context of the discussion of the upcoming World Humanitarian Summit, and again the celebrations of the 50 years of the fundamental principles and the 32nd conference of the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement, we believe that it's very timely to better grasp the understanding of principles among the different relevant actors. Hence, we commissioned this study on principles and pragmatism in conflict settings, perspectives from the field, with the objectives to understand better the way humanitarian agencies practically apply humanitarian principles, to promote humanitarian principles, and to strengthen the application throughout the humanitarian system. The aim is to develop recommendations for states, armed actors, donors, and humanitarian organizations with very practical measures for strengthened operationalization of humanitarian principles based on actual needs and the actual environments and challenges in the field. Just to mention that this research is complemented by a separate paper on states' perspectives on principles humanitarian action, which aims to provide a better understanding on states and their understanding on their perceived challenges to the application of the humanitarian principles, which we hope to publish as well at the end of this year. So I'm just express again my gratitude as well to the consultants that have done an impressive work in Nepal, Colombia, South Sudan and Turkey. And I'm now really much looking forward, together with my team here and Handicap International, to the discussion. And we really hope that this discussion, we can profit from this discussion in order to enrich the study and make, in the end, give a good result. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Christian, and really thank you to well, to you and to NRC for your long time and really proactive focus on strengthening the implementation of humanitarian principles, and thanks for the very interesting work that we're intrigued to hear more about in the coming minutes. So with that, let's move now to introducing Andrew. So Andrew Cunningham is one of several consultants mentioned by Chris who've been working on this study, or in the midst of working on this study. Andrew has 20 years of experience in the humanitarian field. He's been working for a particularly long time with MSF in a variety of contexts and geographical locations. He has specialized in particular in his work in the past with MSF in highly insecure contexts such as Chechnya, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, as well as Somalia. Since leaving MSF, Andrew has been completing a PhD in war studies at King's College London, and has been looking at the relationship between states and international humanitarian organizations, specifically in the context of armed conflict. So we're very pleased to have you with us here today, Andrew, presenting the preliminary results coming out of the 4 field missions. So passing the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for laying the groundwork for this presentation. What I'm going to do over the next 15 or 20 minutes is, on behalf of the team of consultants who have been working on these case studies, to provide some very initial findings. These will be presented more in the form of questions that we have at this point in time. I only having a few minutes to present 4 case studies. I only present selected points, so these will not be all the points that we uncovered in our research. Those will all be in the final report. But just a couple of words about why these particular 4 case studies. The objective was to select a variety of cases from a variety of geographical locations and types of contexts. And as has been mentioned, the focus was on contexts of conflict. But we did pick one. We did pick one case study of a post-conflict, natural disaster-prone context, Nepal, as a counterpoint to see if humanitarian principles were as relevant and as useful there as in other contexts. And through these case studies, we've been looking at patterns, what the commonalities are between the case studies. And one caveat in the presentation, I'm going to go through for each case, each principle in turn, and discuss some of the issues that we find relevance to those principles. But it's not always easy to place all the issues in the specific category. So there's a lot of overlap in how the principles can be interpreted, and which principle category each issue can be placed. So with that, we'll go to the first case study, Colombia. So just to put you in context, Colombia is a long-term conflict, presently in an era of peace talks since 2012. It's, of course, a middle-income context, development context. One interesting feature of Colombia the presence of is referred to as other situations of violence, and these are this is a situations context where violence is there is violence, but it's not related to conflict in a strict sense, but related to criminal activities. In the Colombian context, they're related to post-demobilization and presence of armed groups who are not, technically speaking, part of a conflict. Colombia is also prone to natural disasters. In general, the humanitarian principles are seen to be useful in the Colombian context by the humanitarian organizations which we spoke to, and humanitarian principles are thought to be an important framework for decision making. But there are some particular issues with in the Colombian context, and I'll go through those in turn. Concerning independence, there are two particular issues are interesting to note. And again, please, as I go through these case studies, look at patterns, think about patterns. Concerning independence, politicization of aid and financing issues, and then the government's involvement in aid funding and coordination are two interesting issues that came up. Under the first politicization and funding issues, financing issues, a couple points. One is, of course, the political agenda of donors and then their governments, donor governments, are often related to the peace process and development strategies, development programming, and therefore, humanitarian issues are sometimes purposely sidelined as a result. So the political agendas play a role. The political agendas of donors often plays a role in how humanitarian issues are analyzed, assessed, and responded to. And that's for external actors. Internally, concerning the government of Colombia, the government is quite heavily involved with aid funding and coordination. In fact, the government of Colombia is actually a donor for humanitarian programs within Colombia, which is an interesting situation. And the government is also down at the municipality level very involved with the coordination of humanitarian assistance. So the government itself is quite involved with both the funding and the coordination of humanitarian assistance. And this brings up the question, in such a circumstance, is humanitarian assistance, can humanitarian assistance be independent? Is decision making on the parts of humanitarian actors, non-governmental humanitarian actors, can decision making actually be independent in such a context with the involvement of external actors and internal actors who have political agendas? Next, impartiality. Concerning impartiality, a couple of points to mention. One concerning other situations of violence, and then some access issues. So concerning other situations of violence, and again, these are situations where the population suffers from violence through criminal activity, non-states armed actors who are not directly part of the conflict, and violence associated with demobilized armed actors. There's a lack of a clear legal framework and a lack of clear policies related to facilitating access by humanitarian organizations to the people suffering from these sorts of violence, these other situations of violence. And so such vulnerable groups then sometimes can get left out of humanitarian assistance because as opposed to other more formalized channels of humanitarian assistance to those suffering from the conflict or natural disasters, for example. And there are also access issues, particularly concerning security. Security clearance is not always easy, and is sometimes an issue which limits the access by populations to humanitarian assistance in certain areas. This access related to UN security guidelines or the government's guidelines. So sometimes humanitarian actors will not be able to access the population in certain areas and conflict areas. So this brings up the question, in the Colombian context, do all populations have proper access to humanitarian assistance, or are some discriminated against due to their type of suffering or their location? Next, for neutrality. In the Colombian context, one of the interesting points concerning neutrality was, as mentioned, there's a close link between the humanitarian agencies and the government, and it's the relationship is often a development partnership-like way of operating between humanitarian agencies and the government, which may or may not be conducive to humanitarian organizations, especially in the conflict areas or even in other situations of violence. This may not be conducive to being perceived to be independent, neutral. So they made international organizations or national organizations, NGOs, may be considered to not be neutral because of this close relationship with the government. So so that brings to the question: can humanitarian actors be considered trusted actors by all parties if they are perceived to be not neutral because of this relationship with the government? Next case study, South Sudan. Of course, South Sudan is a long-standing conflict, very long-standing conflict, previously between North and South Sudan. South Sudan is a new state, very low-level development indicators, that is quite unfortunately suffering through quite an intensive period of civil conflict currently. There is, in general, it seems to be a good understanding of humanitarian principles, at least in theory, in the South Sudan context. But there's some concern about the practice, and that's particularly what this research has been looking at, the field level challenges to practice. Often, there is a perception that the humanitarian principles are used as a general framework by humanitarian actors, and the theory of humanitarian principles is clear. But interestingly, there is an idea that various stakeholders, whether governments, local authorities, local communities, in some circumstances will use principles somewhat against humanitarian actors themselves, in inappropriately manipulating the way humanitarian action is provided. This will be discussed a bit more later, and in the reports we'll discuss this more. But this is an interesting. It brings up an interesting question about sometimes the actual practice of using humanitarian principles in the field is understood better by the local actors than it is by the international actors. So let's go through the principles themselves. Independence. Again, we will see politicization and financing issues affecting independence. These are actually quite similar to the Colombian context. The government of South Sudan and the donors often let political agendas affect how aid is implemented. This relates to the civil conflict itself, also the peace process and development indicators. Geopolitically, also, there's a great deal of political interest around the South Sudan conflict, which may prejudice the decision-making donors, the governments, about how humanitarian aid is implemented. And of course, since many organizations are dependent on donor financing, financing is also, the financing affects how aid can be implemented. Funding, so questions arise about funding for whom, for what purpose, and where. And if those decisions and that guidance is based on political interest or purely on humanitarian needs. So again, the question can be, can independent assistance be made, independent decision making on programming in such a context? So it can turn organizations to given the space to independently decide on the programming that they will provide, given such a politicized context. Next, impartiality. Two issues to mention: protection and access and diversion. Concerning protection and access, of course, protection is linked to access. In order to provide implement protection activities, one needs access. Often there is obstruction by the governments to access, bureaucratic obstruction, or obstruction for political reasons, to obstructing international organizations or national NGOs to access certain areas. There are, of course, logistical constraints, lack of infrastructure, weather issues, and there are very serious security issues which also constrain access. This has an impact on the ability of organizations to provide protection activities because of this lack of proximity. On the other side, there is a concern that by the government or local authorities or local communities, there may be a diversion of aid, from the areas which aid was meant to go to other areas based on political or other considerations. So the question here is, do populations needing assistance actually get it? In the situations where NGOs may not have access that they want, or aid is actually diverted, all the populations that need aids, do they actually receive it? Next, neutrality. Neutrality is, in most contexts, more a question of perception than the reality. In the South Sudan context, one issue about the perception of neutrality is that many perceive local NGOs, local actors, and the national staff working for international actors. Many perceive them not to be neutral because of where they come from, or their ethnicity, or their any other distinguishing characterization. So that's this, of course, then means that, for example, if the staff of one organization is not considered to be neutral, then that means that the international NGO itself is perceived to be biased and not neutral, and this creates problems in how the organization is perceived, and therefore how they can actually implement their programming. On the other side, that's a perception by local actors, mostly. On the other side is a distinction. A distinction needs to be made between the NGOs and peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers. There's of course, in any location context where there are humanitarian actors working alongside in the same areas as any sort of peacekeepers, there is an importance of keeping the humanitarian actors separate from the military actors. And again, this is about perception. And so it's also importance for humanitarian actors to be perceived not to be part of a military agenda, whether it's local military actors or state military actors or peacekeepers. So in this particular context, as in many contexts, the basic question is how can NGOs maintain the perception of neutrality? So next, Syria. Syria, of course, is a very active current conflict, civil conflict. It's highly insecure, of course, for the populations primarily, but also for the NGOs. It's a very insecure place to try to function as an international or a national NGO. It's a middle-income context, highly internationalized, geopolitically very sensitive conflict, and a region crisis. There are multiple hubs for this report's. That's the Turkey side, but then there's also, of course, the Lebanese side and the Jordan side. So it's a very complex environment within which to provide assistance, and a very insecure context within which to provide assistance. In general, humanitarian principles are known by the actors, but the implementation is extremely difficult, especially in the remote management nature of the operations, which I'll talk about in a second. And Fadi will talk about this more, I think, later. But humanitarian principles are, of course, new to Syrian NGOs, as, of course, being an NGO is also new to Syrian NGOs. That's also an interesting dynamic in the Syrian context. So for independence, 2 issues to mention. Independence, I found to be quite a sensitive issue for international NGOs, especially in the Syrian context, because the independence in NGOs often would understand that they were somewhat beholden to the political agendas of the donor governments. So there was a perceived lack of independence by many NGOs in how they could function in that highly politicized context. One particular issue, which is highly relevant to the Syrian context, is counterterrorism laws. Counterterrorism laws, sanctions lists, and make it very, very difficult for organizations to properly negotiate access because certain groups they're not meant to interact or negotiate with certain armed actors, non-state armed actors, which makes it difficult to negotiate access, and it makes it difficult for NGOs to make independent determinations about where and with whom they will work. So in this situation, a question is, how much do counterterrorism laws affect independent assessments, independent implementation of humanitarian programming? There are many other places in the world where counterterrorism laws are also quite relevant. So that's a more general question also. Impartiality. There is a conflation with neutrality and impartiality, and in this context, the issues is that the two concepts are often discussed together as one concept with two different perspectives. So that's not always distinct, just in a distinct way. Access issues are also quite a challenge. There is the security challenge, which has necessitated a remote management system of operations, which also means that often insecurity has a profound impact on access, the ability of international organizations to access the populations they would like to assist. And so, how can they be impartial is the overriding question for that sort of context. The next, neutrality. In the Syrian context, one of the very often heard comments is neutrality is impossible in the Syrian context. This is the case for international and national agencies. In a highly internationalized, sensitive political context, it is a question whether there are possibly some neutrality-free zones for humanitarian action in the world. So in the Syrian context, may be one of those, but we'll discuss that later. In the Nepal context, very briefly, because I'm running out of time, it's a development context. It's a post-conflict context, very prone to natural disaster, politically very unstable. Humanitarian principles are known in Nepal, but it's a development context, and the humanitarian principles are not used as much under normal circumstances as in a conflict zone. So organizations often have to catch up when an emergency happens and shift their perspective into a more principled humanitarian approach. And there is some debate in the Nepal context whether humanitarian principles are actually relevant to development program contexts, development context. And also in the Nepal context, the typical terminology is often not used, so others are used to talk about the same concepts as the traditional principal terms are used. So for independence in the Nepal context, it's two issues to mention. Of course, there is a difference between a development and an emergency context. In the development context, decision-making is typically more closely aligned to the government. In an emergency context, agencies typically want to have greater control over their programming. So this creates a tension in the shift between a development to an emergency context. And also, so in an emergency situation, it's often hard for relief agencies to work outside the normal development system. Also in the Nepal context, it's not an external actors which are politicized the context. Is actually the government of Nepal's policies which guide decision making. So it's the politicization is not by an external actor; it's by the government. So one question here is how to shift from a government-aligned development program to a more independent emergency aid program perspective. Impartiality. One of the issues for Nepal is often, for very socio-political reasons, there is an issue with social exclusion of certain groups. International agencies typically want to target those most excluded from assistance. The governments of Nepal typically does not appreciate this focus. So often there is under normal circumstances and also in emergencies, the government would prefer an equitable distribution system rather than a targeted distribution system, which means that the government would like to distribute to everyone with no targeting, and international agencies want to reverse, especially in emergencies. So the question is, how does the most in need gets aid in an emergency within this development context? And finally, neutrality. Two issues. Often organizations feel that they are co-opted by political actors, by the government or political parties. And so this creates a constant tension, trying not to be drawn into the political debates. And also, but it is so in this situation, it's not a conflict which is influencing the political discussions and within the politicization of this situation. It's actually the internal domestic political tensions. So it's not the international organizations don't have to worry about armed actors. They have to worry more about political actors, political parties, for example. So the question arises: how to use neutrality, principle of neutrality, in relation to political actors and issues whereas mostly the neutrality issue is applied to armed actors. So, just to conclude, as you will notice, humanity is a foundational principle. But as you notice, humanity did not come up in this review, and it typically did not come up in discussions with the interlocutors. This is interesting in that humanity is the foundational principle from which all the others are derived, and is at the core of humanitarian action. Yeah, it's not mentioned or discussed very often, and sometimes going back to the principle of humanity can help an organization clarify some of its dilemmas, as it reminds humanitarians what they are there for and what they are not there for. So it's I think a little bit more discussion of humanity would be a good thing in any discussion about principles. Again, looking at patterns, we've discussed these, so I won't elaborate on them, but access constraints, financing of aid, and politicization and diversion were all challenges in their own way, challenges in each of the contexts. And also, this is a bit of a disconnect between theory and practice, which is why we were indeed looking at the field perspective from the beginning. We all understand the theory hopefully we all understand the theory of principles. It's the practice where there are issues and challenges. So we really needs to look at the actual field level constraints, challenges, how we implement our programs better. And then one of the final questions to throw out there is there is a tension between the principles and pragmatism. So we have our theory and we have our challenges in the field. How much do we want to be pragmatic in how we implement programming principled humanitarian action in the field? And that is a very quick review of 4 different case studies.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Andrew. Very interesting to hear the takeaways so far from this research. And again, I think a great opportunity for us to get a window into your work even before it's complete. So thanks so much for pulling that together and presenting it today. A couple of notes. I saw some questions coming in during the presentation regarding whether the slides would be available. The slides standalone will not be available. However, you can go back to view the recording of the event, which will be available afterwards. And through the recording, you'll be able to see the slides as they go by, as well as the chat, the polls, and everything in real time. So we'll provide that link to you by email a couple of hours after the event. I'd also like to note again, very importantly, this study is still underway, also as Andrew and Chris mentioned, and part of the idea for today's event is actually to collect additional data to inform the study. So for that purpose, we'll be circulating after the event an additional follow-up, but we hope that you'll all take the time to answer a few additional questions following the event based on your own experience when you've had an opportunity to reflect on the discussions today and on your own experience. So with that, thank you once again to Andrew, and we'll be inviting in now and introducing 2 additional panelists. It's my great pleasure to welcome Natalie Elmo-Zorchak, who is Director of Operational Development at Handicap International Foundation. The purpose of her unit is very interesting. It's to direct, advise, and assist decision-making on ethical and political issues faced by Handicap International in its daily activities. And this includes regular field visits, for example, to Albania, the occupied Palestinian territory, Kenya, Mozambique, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, many other locations where Handicap International is active, to really engage with colleagues colleagues who are, in some cases, I'm sure, struggling with making principled decisions, ethical decisions on the ground, and she's advising in those processes. So very happy to have Natalie with us today. And I would also like to give a warm welcome to and introduce Fadi Hakim, who is currently the coordinator of the Syrian NGO Alliance, has been since June of this year, and prior to holding this position was the deputy chief of the Aleppo Health Office, responsible for the monitoring and support of all medical activities in the Aleppo Governorate. So we're going to pick up on a few of the points that that Andrew left us with, and starting in particular with, so both the disconnect that Andrew pointed to between theory and practice, and also the reflection on awareness of humanitarian principles in different parts of the sector and in related entities, related organizations. Pick up on some of these and pose some questions to our panel. We had a couple of questions come in already along these lines. One from Ibrahima in Chad that I'll bring up. And let's see, I'll pose this initial question to Natalie. So Natalie, feel free to offer any initial reflections on the overall study, and then if possible, to respond to Ibrahima's question. So Ibrahima is bringing up, I think, an important concern regarding awareness of humanitarian principles. He's asking, from his experience, he's run into challenges where it is just blatantly unacceptable in the eyes of the civilian population in need when they observe a humanitarian agency, albeit adhering to principles, but as a result assisting someone else whom they don't see, not in their own community, and not providing needed assistance in their community. So how do you see that link, Natalie, between on the organization side, adhering to humanitarian principles, and from the perspective of a population in need or a person in need, understanding that from their own perspective? Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you. Thank you, and hi, everybody. Well, I think here we touched one of the main challenges related to humanitarian principles, and that we really could see in the previous presentation, which is related to the issue of perception. The question really underlines everybody has its own perception of humanitarian principles. So there is a kind of lack of knowledge, maybe, but more it's more a way where each actor is going to have its own understanding of humanitarian principles, and among those actors, the beneficiaries or the people affected will also have their own understanding of humanitarian principles. That means that there are some people in need that will see humanitarian agencies helping others, and that will think that it is not impartial. And on the other side, other people in need will also think the same thing. So that's what we saw in the field. This issue of perception is really something that is linked with, I think, a common knowledge of the fact that humanitarian principles exist, but that everybody has its own perception on humanitarian principles. So I think it's very difficult from 4 case studies to just give some kind of generalizations, but there are some kind of practical lessons or maybe practical questions or scopes to be further analyzed that we can just underline. And one of them is that today humanitarian principles are not a global package, for sure, because actors in the field make some choices, referring to well, choices that are at the same time compromises, of course, but those choices refer to humanitarian principles, but they may put them in a kind of competition between one and another. So it's not a global package, but still they are living, and they are so much living that everybody just has and develop its own understanding of the principles. That means that humanitarian principles are no longer the property of humanitarian actors, and that where we really reach the point of the issue of perception, which is not only an issue of a good or a bad understanding. It's just that any actor will have its own understanding of humanitarian principles, and even the affected population, of course.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. I would like to turn now to Fadi. And Fadi, if you have any reflections on Ibrahima's question, they would be very welcome. I would also, though, like to add in another one that's just come in from Mohammed, who's currently in Pakistan. And Mohammed is asking, so again, on the theme of awareness or understanding of humanitarian principles, and possibly also the issue of that disconnect between theory and practice, Mohammed is wondering, how can we make neutrality and impartiality better understood, specifically among local staff in an organization who may be very new to humanitarian action? And I think what he may be getting at is, would you have possibly any practical observations that you could share for him, or any practical suggestions? And I think we can ask the participants in the room as well if they have any. So over to you, Mohammed. Sorry, over to you, Fadi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be a participant with you today. If I would comment on Mohammed's question regarding about the separation between the practice and the theory and the understanding of the humanitarian principle with the local staff. Well, I will try to give reflections based on the experience that we have in Syria, and that would be the interesting part that you might be interested to hear from me. One of the most important challenges that we are facing is that most of our local staff initially were not workers within the humanitarian domain before the start of the Syrian crisis, which means that this response was based on a reflection to the population's need after the start of everything. And this was in some sort of, let's say, defined by geographic area and areas of control, which make us, let's say, incapable to practice the neutrality or the impartiality, even if we wanted to, because usually the NGOs, or at least the local NGOs, are working on whether one side of the conflict or the other side. So that was some sort of the confusion at the beginning, but was also the change of state of mind when we start to get in the system of the NGOs and start to understand and hear about the humanitarian principles. You add this to your acquired knowledge, and you compare it with the lack of knowledge with the humanitarian principles and how the non-governmentals should be operating on the field, which create this sensitivity. Well, what we are trying to do is now to explain to the public opinion, to explain more about the principle that we are doing, and to convince them that this is for the best of them and for the better application of the let's say the presentation of the all sorts of humanitarian assistance that we are trying to. So yeah, it's always a challenge. In the Syrian context, I can say that we did not have the possibility to practice it a lot, again, because of the separation of the sidelines. And if we have, I think we only have one or two actors that can be operating on both sides of the conflict. And usually when people are looking at them, they are considering them lacking the notion of the independence. So you are trying to fulfill one of the humanitarian principles only to be judged by lacking one of the others, which is the independence, because they might consider them one way, let's say, following the opinion of the government, or other partners or stakeholders. So yeah, to find the real balance between all of that in practice is a little bit challenging. But this is the let's say the experience that we are having in Syria right now.
Great, thank you, Fadi. And I'd like to stay with you, if I may, with a follow-up question regarding language. So thinking about the example of Syria, but also potentially any other example that may come to your mind, would you say that that we're too could say, hung up on the specific formulation of humanitarian principles? Is there a risk that in the explanation they perhaps don't translate well? Do you think that there's actually a need for the humanitarian community to work on reformulating them so that they make sense in a certain local context, while of course maintaining the main underlying ideas? What are your thoughts, Fadi?
Well, just in last week, but in a similar discussion that we were having with the Global Protection Cluster about the availability of enough resources to explain notions of protection in Arabic, we have discovered that in too many fields of the humanitarian activities, the presence of the Arabic language is not yet, let's say, well enough implemented, which created, of course, a certain gap of knowledge. For me, at least, with the humanitarian principle, I find that usually the translation in Arabic is really confusing between neutrality and impartiality. And when I'm doing the translation, I usually do it in the inverse way. I mean, using the Arabic terminology, which it brings more sense, at least to the understanding. But when a term is coined, the term is coined, and sometimes even if it's in contrary or sometimes in a contrary to the common sense, it was adopted like that. So yeah, maybe some sessions to revise the terminology and try to add some more, let's say, closeness to the common thinking would be helpful within the context. But I also believe that let's say the language is not the only barrier that's preventing the understanding. Usually you need to practice, you need to really establish a certain history or experience within the Syrian NGOs or the local NGOs. And I believe that this experience was absent in Syria before 2011, which requires a lot of work to have the real essence of the principles incorporated in our actions, regardless if they was presented to us in Arabic or in English.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Fadi, for that. I'd like to turn now back to Andrew. So with two questions. First, Andrew, we have a question essentially of clarification, but also asking you to elaborate a little bit more, and we don't want to take too much time for elaboration, but just to elaborate a little bit more on a statement that you made regarding challenges, and I think you may have even used the word that it may be impossible in some cases to adhere to the principle of neutrality in Syria. So we had a question from Gerson coming in, who was asking, what is it? Is it the high degree of injustice? Is it the heavy politicization? Could you elaborate just a little bit, Andrew, on that statement?
Sure. Of course, I'm reporting on what we discovered through the interviews of actors actually working in the context, international and national actors. In each of the case studies, there was the one principle which the predominant, the principle which had the most challenges associated with it. In the Syrian context, it was definitely neutrality. I was actually the one that did the Syria case study, and I would often ask an open-ended question about principles to see which principle was mentioned first, because that usually indicates that it's the one that people think about the most and the one that's challenged the most. Neutrality by far was the biggest challenge and the one that was mentioned the most. There was quite a number of interlocutors who said to me that, well, neutrality is, in theory, neutrality is important, but there are no neutral actors in Syria, and the reasons given for this typically was that. For Syrians, for anybody who is working for a local NGO or for a partner organization, an organization partnering with international organization or national staff of the international organization, is that as Syrians, it was never very difficult for Syrians to work in Syria and be neutral as individuals, as Syrians, in the Syrian context. And for international organizations, many international organizations said that because of the highly politicized nature of the context, that it was very difficult for international organizations to be to remain neutral. Personally, I'm not sure that we can say that it's a neutrality-free zone, but I throw that question out there. It's maybe there are some situations where neutrality is extremely difficult, maybe not impossible, extremely difficult to uphold.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And now turning back to Natalie, we have a question coming in from Fausto in Ethiopia. And this is one more question, again, on awareness of humanitarian principles. But Fausto is coming from another angle. He's asking, really, whose responsibility is it to ensure that the actors who should be aware of humanitarian principles, having an understanding of humanitarian principles, whose responsibility is it that they have that understanding? And he's asking, is it not the onus of humanitarian actors, or shouldn't the onus be on humanitarian actors to ensure that others have that understanding by justifying their interventions and explaining them in the context of the principles? Or do you see others having obligations to spread that understanding of awareness? Over to you, Natalie.
Each actor that is doing something in the field must really explain why and how this actor has made its own choices, just in order the population can understand. Given the fact that there is some kind of differences in the perceptions of humanitarian principles, that means that each actor will have to explain its own choices, even if there is, of course, a global there are global explanations of humanitarian principles, but when you're working in the field, you need to explain why you choose to do that thing or another one. That's really important. And I think this is rather linked to another question that I've just seen on the screen, referring to how to remain impartial and in the same time making choice. We make choice because we choose to deliver some aid to one group of population or another. So is it still impartiality or is it partiality? I think impartiality is not, impartiality is related to making choice, of course. It's not refusing to make choice, and impartiality is not equality, as it is written in the global definition. Impartiality giving, referring to the needs. That means that it is really important to elaborate the needs assessment with the affected populations, because the way people think their needs is also related to their own culture, their cultural environment, and that means that impartiality is not only the way we consider the needs, but also the way people in their own culture and in their organizations consider their needs. And that's, I think, some that could be some. Well, that could be a way we could, I think, improve a little bit the way we develop our impartial activities and the way they are understood by the affected populations. Because most of the time we just think impartiality referring to our own cultural environments and referring to some kind of equality, whereas in some societies it does not work like this. And so we really need to link our need analysis with a do no harm analysis. That means that we need to really include in our choices an analysis of the cultural environments of the people we are working with, just in order that they understand that we are impartial, making our own choices.
Excellent. Thank you, Natalie. So I'd like to come back to you, Natalie, and we're moving now more into this additional cross-cutting theme highlighted by Andrew, looking at politicization and linked to issues with diversion of aid. And we have a couple of participants I can see with experience in South Sudan, and then Andrew had mentioned that the case study of South Sudan pointed to aid diversion happening at multiple levels in the government, and we also have, let's see, Sunday Kilara, now in Uganda, but who's just returned from Nepal, observing diversion in various forms. In your experience, or perhaps talking to colleagues who have been speaking with those, say, example, in South Sudan, have you observed, or have others close to you observed, that these challenges of diversion in South Sudan have actually gone so far as to impact the perceived neutrality of humanitarian actors? Or do you find that humanitarian actors are managing to somehow manage or deal with the diversion and handle it on the side without allowing it to affect the way they're perceived as neutral? Back to you, Natalie.
Okay, that's a complex question, but I'll try to give some views on that. I think there are two different ways to answer the question. The first one is, of course, there is a kind of a global diversion of aid in South Sudan from any actors, and of course this has an impact on the way the different actors are perceived by the others and by the local population. But even the affected population have grown very clever in trying to use humanitarian aid. So everybody is trying to to go into a kind of diversion of humanitarian aid. This is also linked with the fact that we are still in an open conflict. Well, rather not completely closed, we're going to say. And that means that there is a direct link between diversion of aid and neutrality of the different actors, and of course the perception of their neutrality. Just like in Syria, it's very difficult in South Sudan to be a local actor and to remain neutral, because, well, the conflict is just their lives. So you can't just ask somebody living in a country where there is a very strong internal conflict not to have a position in this conflict. It's very difficult. So even the local population, the affected population, they think that all the local NGOs are politicized, and when they come to bring some aid, they of course think that they're going to divert it. So there is a kind of game between perception and real action, which makes very difficult finally to know how many, what is the level of diversion of aid at the governmental level, at the actors level, and even how the local population and the affected people play with the aid that is provided. I don't know if I really answered the question, but that's a kind of a very complex system where perception and real actions are really merging together.
Excellent. Thank you, Natalie. I think it was a valiant effort, and thank you for that. I'm going to move back now to Andrew, and then I'll go to Fadi. But going back to Andrew, and this is staying on the issue of politicization and diversion. The case study in Nepal pointed out a violation of the principle of impartiality, seeing humanitarian actors not being able to address the relatively greater needs of certain groups due to government policy. However, at the same time, we see Nepal being held up by many as an example of how host governments can constructively take control over the coordination of aid. So the question here, and maybe also a tough in this case, are we likely to see more of this kind of tension if other governments follow the same route as Nepal? So stepping back a bit, Andrew, what do you forecast? Is this going to be a bigger and bigger issue as we move forward?
Okay. The tension definitely is very real, and it's particularly the case in a situation like Nepal, and there are many others which are post-conflict, or there's a very minor conflict in the country, but otherwise it's a development context. And most of the engagement between international actors and local actors and the governments relates to development activities. Yeah, Nepal is indeed held up as a good example of the engagement by the governments in development programming. And I think this, I must admit, I don't know too much about development context, but it does seem to me that that is seen as a positive, something positive, because of course governments are not just in theory, but practically speaking, they are and they should be responsible for the provision of development aid, at least, and even for many would argue for humanitarian assistance. And so it's a positive indication of the seriousness of the government's engagement on these issues if they are intimately involved with the provision of assistance. But there are negative consequences to that, not only in the context of humanitarian assistance, emergency assistance, but under normal circumstances. Governments, of course, will have their own perspectives, which may clash with the perspectives of international actors. And this tension will continue. It will be. I'm sure it's seen in many other contexts, and it will continue to be seen in other contexts. This is something that has to be, I think, dealt with in the development world, but it's also something particular to natural disaster response in such development contexts, because different logics, in a certain way, different logics apply in the provision of emergency assistance and then in the provision of development assistance. So it is difficult for humanitarian actors to step into a development context and using their humanitarian logic, but needing to focus, provide assistance in a logic which is alien to their normal way of operating. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think yes, it will. This is a theme that will be more and more pertinent as time goes on.
Right, thanks, Andrew. And I think, again, a valiant effort on the question, so thanks for that. And moving now to Fadi, and also looking at the time, we're going to move on to our third theme, cross-cutting theme, which is financing of aid. We have seen, and through the helpful presentation from Andrew, the case studies pointing to a wide range of ways in which donors approach principles depending on the context. So we had the case of Nepal, with Western donors actively pushing for a more principled approach in their negotiations with government, to South Sudan, where donor priorities compete with each other, and then in the Syria context, where counterterrorism efforts in many cases seem to trump principled action in the eyes of donor governments. So thinking about your own experience, but also possibly comparatively to Fadi, what should we ask of donors as humanitarian actors, given these diverse contexts? What can we reasonably expect from donors in terms of consistency across contexts? Over to you.
Well, I'll try to answer this question on two levels, starting by the direct answers about the influence of the counterterrorism measures and how they have affected the principles. I believe that Syria have witnessed, especially in the last year, a significant decrease in the amounts of humanitarian aids developed to the areas under the control of ISIS, because mostly this is something that most of the let's say, at least the local actors would be afraid to be accused one way or another, because certain let's say misunderstanding of the application of any part of the implementation process, and to be considered as part of the terrorist group, which will end in the stopping of all their humanitarian activities in other places in Syria. So let's say many of the actors are trying to take the safe side on that, which is, let's say, in contrary with the as Andrew was saying, the most important principle, which is the humanity, and really to try to deliver the assistance to the people, no matter where they are located. So one of the recommendations that we are trying to work on now is to really find ways and, let's say, define ways to protect and to provide protections for all of these humanitarian actors that are willing to provide assistance into an area which is initially so dangerous. So at least they may not be feeling in a double pressure situation from the ground and also from the requirements of the donor. But this is something I believe it's not easy to take. One example also in particular, especially about the pooled fund, which is usually something directly sent to the local NGOs to help them to build their capacities. And we have seen in the Syrian context, we call it the HPF, or the Humanitarian Pool Fund, that even the simplest transactions taking a lot of time because of all, the double checking and the verification of the counterterrorism to make sure that the money is not transferred to the wrong hands. But yeah, I need one of the recommendations should be to provide more help to the NGOs working out there, because really the situation for the population is really horrible. But if I will now go to another dimension of the politicization and speak about the good aspects, maybe I believe that let's say the influence of the politicization and the neutrality in the Syrian context has been limited effectively by the usage of the multiple hubs. This is one of the crises where we do not have, let's say, a control of the government on the whole aspects of the, let's say, humanitarian coordination, because we have we have distinct hubs. And let's say with the UN Security Council resolution about the allowance of assistance of the cross-border activities, you cannot see always the possibility of one side to be in control, and to compromise the neutrality at the application of assistance. And that was something really interesting and successful to be applicated in the Syrian context. But again, there are still some gray areas when, for example, you have this issue of the besieged area, because usually the mitigation of the political pressure was usually by simply diverting the assistance from one hub to another hub to get the access. But if you don't have the access from a certain hub, and there are some people in a besieged situation, and where the person who is surrounding them is not, let's say, ready to be neutral and to provide the assistance, this is where we are getting really in serious trouble. So also one thing that we are trying to advocate to is to bring more focus on who is preventing the access on these besieged area, because mitigating simply by transferring from one hub to another is not always an effective solution.
Great, thanks so much, Fadi. So we're running a little short on time. We're going to move to a final area that I can see now through the questions and many of the comments we've received is a really primary concern, and that is access constraints. So I'd like to bring in a couple of participant comments and questions here. I'll start with one from Courtney, and Natalie, if I may, I'll pose this to you first. Courtney is asking the following: what are the primary situations in which you have seen the need for principles to be set aside in order to deliver aid? Is it possible to find a line where that is acceptable or not? Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you. I think, of course, that kind of question is really a challenge in situation of internal conflicts, where it's very difficult to gain access in all the areas, depending on who is just holding them. But I would say first answer would be never, because we're talking here about the principles with an S. And as I said before, I think it's not a package. So there are situations where you need to make some choice between principles, for sure. And those situations of armed internal conflicts are some situations where you really need to make some choice. That means that if you want really, if you think there is a humanitarian imperative to be there and to act, then sometimes you have to choose not to be completely independent, not to be completely neutral, or to be seen as neutral in order to be able to gain access. It means that in some part of a country, and of course a very good example is Syria, if you want to gain access in some part of the country, you need not to be completely independent from some local actors that are not neutral. If you need to find some partners, you know that they will not be neutral. But in the end, what is really important is that you succeed in delivering impartial humanitarian assistance in the areas that you feel that are the most in need. So in some places, you cannot deliver humanitarian assistance being at the same time impartial, neutral, and independent. And usually, well, each organization is going to make its own choice, but usually what we favor as humanitarian actors is impartiality. We are really referring to the humanitarian imperative, the fact that otherwise the other solution is doing nothing, and doing nothing is not impartial at all, neither. So yes, I think there are some situations, especially in internal conflicts, where you need to just balance a little bit the principles, but I would say that you always keep in mind what is for you the most important principle in this situation. That's why I just started my answer to say never, because we still keep in mind at least one of the principles that is related to the do no harm analysis and the humanitarian imperative.
Thanks so much, Natalie, for that question. And I'd like to come now, sorry for that answer. I'd like to come now to Andrew with another question coming in from Anders, who's currently based in Spain. So I think this is an appropriate question for the researcher. So I'm glad we have you here with us today. Anders is wondering if when thinking about principles and access, if there's a need to differentiate between so-called donantist organizations, so he points to the ICRC and, quote, arguably MSF. He observes that ICRC and MSF tend to be more systematically present in insecure, challenging armed conflict environments. And at the same time, Anders observes that the ICRC and MSF tend to have a reputation for, say, being more principled or having a particularly strong institutional culture of adherence to humanitarian principles. Should we therefore conclude that by following principles, or following principles better, humanitarian organizations will have or can have improved access? Or Anders is asking, is this actually a fallacy? Is there something else at play when we compare an organization like the ICRC or an organization like MSF with other humanitarian actors? Over to you, Andrew.
Okay. I will answer this in a personal perspective, and that's as part of the study. That's the only way I can answer this, and just realizing that I come from an MSF background. So personally, I think that it's extremely difficult for multi-mandate organizations to implement humanitarian operations, and especially in conflict areas, because they do not engage purely in humanitarian operations, and they have other principles, other policies, other beliefs, other guiding principles, which also impact on their decision making. So personally, I think it is the case that it is easier for organizations, donantist organizations, which are purely humanitarian organizations and which put humanitarian principles at the center of their decision making. It is easier for them to gain access, negotiate access, and work in the most sensitive areas. I think it's much more difficult for multi-mandate organizations to work in such areas. And of course, prime issues for why it's easier for, I think, for organizations such as MSF and ICRC is independence in decision making, because because they are not donor driven. Of course, ICRC has been going on in the chats. ICRC, of course, gets a lot of money from external donors, but it goes to pool, and so they're not funded for particular operations, so they make decisions independently of the wishes of the donors, and MSF, of course, is self-funded. So also there's financial independence, which makes a huge difference in the organization's abilities to provide humanitarian assistance in conflict zones and negotiate an access based on principles. So yes, I think it's much easier for donantist humanitarian organizations to negotiate access in conflict zones, and it's much more difficult for multi-mandate non-donantist organizations to do so.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Andrew. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we actually still have questions coming in. We've managed to get to as many participant questions and comments as I think we'll be able to during this hour and a half. We're going to have to wrap things up. I'd like to give a very warm thanks once again to all of our panelists, to Andrew particularly for the excellent presentation, and for Christian for starting us off, and of course to all of our participants here today. And then I'd like to go around one more time across our panel just to give each of you an opportunity for closing remarks. We've covered a lot of ground today. There have been a lot of challenging questions posed by the group in this virtual room, and any parting thoughts you'd like to leave us with today would be very welcome. We'll go in the following order: first to Fadi, then to Andrew, and then to Natalie, representing Handicap International. So over to you, Fadi.
Well, thank you. I'll try to be short, but I would also try to remind the audience of today that at least in the Syrian context, and even if see that some of the locals are trying their best to implement according to the principles, but they are not yet succeeding in doing that, you need I would like to bring the attention that many of these humanitarian workers were killed during their mandate or their efforts to provide the assistance to the population. So when we see that the humanitarian actors are really and literally risking their lives to try to alleviate the human suffering, I can understand that there is a certain learning curve, but the good intentions are there, and the best thing that we can do for them is to make them to bring them more assistance, to build their capacities, and to give them this protection umbrella to be capable to help more the affected population. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadi, and thanks so much for connecting and being with us today. Over to you, Andrew, for brief closing remarks.
I think the one thing that I would like to emphasize is a point I made earlier about humanity. We're always talking about the other three principles, and of course we don't actually talk about the other however many principles that ICRC refers to. But in the four principles that we commonly discuss, we talk about independence, neutrality, and impartiality, which is quite important. We rarely talk about humanity, and I think it would speak good if we talked about that a bit more, because if you start with humanities, a lot of the other ones disappear if you ground humanitarian action in the principles of humanity, as use it as a foundation principle, start the logic from that point, make some of the other discussions a bit easier. Grounding humanitarian action in the simple idea that it's humans helping other humans who are in crisis. I think starting from that standpoint, it makes some of the other dilemmas a bit easier.
Thank you for that, Andrew, and I think a really important point and a good opportunity for me to, again, very highly recommend for any of you who may be interested in following a discussion specifically on that foundational principle of humanity, to check out the recording of our event with Hugo Slim from the ICRC that took place last month, and you'll see a link to that at the end of today's event. And now turning to you, Natalie, for the closing word, and thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Well, of course, there would be so many things to say on humanitarian principles, and I think to continue this debate for a long time. But just one thing that is really, I think, important is to keep in mind that, of course, coexistence between humanitarian principles and pragmatism will always be a challenge. But this is really one of our responsibility as humanitarian actors to make some ethical choices, and we will never have long-lasting recipes for every situation. So I think the complexity of keeping humanitarian principles alive in the complex situation we're facing in the ground will always be our reality. And that's also our responsibility of humanitarian actors. The second point I just wanted to raise as a conclusion is that, of course, as we all know, we are not intervening in a vacuum. So we know that humanitarian settings are also connected with previous environments. And in this environment, there is a kind of a system that is built through the international system of humanitarian response. And all the choices of all the actors that have different perception, different understandings, will also have an impact on the way the system is organized. And this system has an impact on the way each actor can act in the field. So this is also something we need to keep in mind, is that it's not, well, we know that we all make our own choices, but not only, because we are also working inside a kind of a system, and there are some very complex interactions between individual choices of organizations and this global system, which is another element of complexity that may impact also the implementation of humanitarian principles. But I think that should be for another debate.
Great. Thanks so much, Natalie, for those closing thoughts, and thanks once again for being on our panel today. We look forward to welcoming all of you again for another interesting discussion and debate. So with that, we'll wrap things up. I would like to just point out quickly that you'll have the recording and related resources available at the link you see in front of you there on the screen. That will also be emailed to you in the event follow-up email in a couple of hours after we close today. I'll also one more time just point out, in case you missed our previous sessions looking from various angles at humanitarian principles over the last month and a half, highly recommend this series moderated by Marc Dubois and featuring a number of guest experts and panelists from across the sector. You can see the links there again in front of you, and I'll ask my colleagues to be sure to include those links as well in the follow-up email from today's session. And then looking ahead, if you would like to continue these discussions, and particularly taking a practical look at how principles are applied in today's humanitarian operations in different parts of the world, and looking at perspectives from the field, we would welcome you and encourage you to join an upcoming event by STITE here in Geneva. This will be an online live webinar event entitled Humanity, Neutrality, Impartiality, and Independence. Are these principles applied in today's humanitarian operations? Perspectives from the field. That event will take place online on the 22nd of October, and there will be 2 sessions on that day to accommodate the full range of time zones across the world. So please do follow that link and sign up for the upcoming STITE webinar on the 22nd of October. So with that, I'll just end with a few quick thank yous. Very warm thank you to Norwegian Refugee Council and also to Handicap International, and congratulations on their initiative with this work. Thanks so much for working with us in the production of today's event, and for all of your work with the studies that we're able to feed into it. I'm sure I speak for many when I say we very much look forward to the finished product and wish you all the best for your continued work. For our participants, if you would like to follow up on the work of any of these 3 organizations, NRC, Handicap International, or PHAP, you can find the links there on your screen. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues Leonie and Marcus for their invaluable support, as well as our colleague Saranjana for database assistance. And I'll wish all of you a very good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are around the world today, and look forward to welcoming you again soon. This is Inherit Lang signing off for PHAP from Geneva.